The elevator doors on the 40th floor of Whitfield Meridian Tower opened to a silence so sharp it felt engineered, and Claire Whitfield walked into it like she owned every molecule of air in the room. She had exactly 11 minutes before the board reconvened to vote on whether she stayed in the corner office her father had built, and she intended to spend every one of those minutes proving she deserved it. The open floor plan stretched out before her, glass-walled offices catching the gray Manhattan light. Phones lighting up in silent rows, and near the supply closet by the north wing, a man in a faded navy uniform was on his knees scrubbing a coffee stain out of the carpet with the kind of patience that made her stomach twist for reasons she refused to name. His name tag read Daniel. She had walked past him 100 times without learning anything more than that, and some small, buried part of her had always found that fact more comfortable than she wanted to admit. Marcus Delgado, the board's newest and loudest voice of doubt, stepped out of the adjoining conference room right behind her, his tablet already lit with the quarterly numbers she'd fought for weeks to keep from looking as bad as they actually were. He fell into step beside her without invitation, the way men like him always did, certain that proximity to power was owed to them rather than earned. He said the shareholders were asking hard questions about leadership stability, that 2 board members had used the word inexperienced in a call just that morning. And he said it loudly enough that 3 analysts near the printer stopped pretending not to listen. Claire felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her, the particular vertigo of watching her own legitimacy get weighed in front of an audience that hadn't even bothered to lower its voice. She had inherited this company at 29, 3 years after her father's heart gave out in this very building, and every day since had felt like defending a verdict that hadn't been rendered yet, as though grief itself were something the board expected her to justify on a quarterly basis. She needed something decisive, something visible, something that would travel down the hallway and into the boardroom before the vote even started. Something that would make Marcus Delgado's mouth close for once. And there, kneeling on the carpet with a bottle of stain remover and a rag gone gray from use, was an opportunity she hated herself a little for recognizing, even as she reached for it. Daniel had missed his shift twice last month, according to the facilities report she'd skimmed that morning, without really reading it. And building maintenance had flagged a complaint about a supply closet left unlocked overnight. It wasn't much. It didn't need to be much. It needed to be fast, and it needed witnesses. And she told herself in the clipped internal voice she used whenever she needed permission to do something she wasn't proud of, that rules were rules, regardless of who broke them. Claire stopped 3 feet from him and said his name loud enough to carry, and the entire floor's ambient noise seemed to fold inward. Phones muting themselves, keyboards going still, someone's coffee mug pausing halfway to their mouth. Daniel looked up at her with an expression that held no fear in it at all, which struck her even then as strange, though she filed the thought away too fast to examine it properly. She told him that his performance over the last quarter had been unacceptable, that the missed shifts and the unlocked closet represented exactly the kind of carelessness her building could not tolerate, and that effective immediately, his employment with Whitfield Meridian was terminated. Her voice didn't shake. She'd practiced not shaking a long time ago, back when shaking had cost her things she couldn't afford to lose, back when a younger version of herself had learned that hesitation read as weakness to men who were already looking for a reason to dismiss her. Daniel set the rag down slowly, deliberately, the way a man moves when he has already decided the outcome of a conversation before it started. He rose to his full height, taller than she'd registered from a distance, broader through the shoulders than the uniform let on, and for a moment, his eyes moved past her to Marcus Delgado's tablet, to the huddle of analysts pretending to work, to the glass wall of the boardroom, where 3 board members had gathered early to watch the small drama unfolding on the floor below their meeting. Something flickered across his face that Claire would later try and fail to name, something closer to disappointment than anger. The particular weariness of a man watching a mistake compound itself in real time. He said only that she was making a mistake she didn't yet understand the size of, and that he hoped, for her sake, she figured that out before it cost her more than a supply closet ever could. Then he untied his work apron, folded it with unnecessary precision, set it on the cart beside his cleaning supplies, and walked toward the elevator without looking back. Once his footsteps unhurried in a way that felt less like defeat and more like a man simply choosing when to leave a room. The silence that followed felt different from the one before. Heavier, laced with something Claire couldn't identify until Marcus Delgado let out a short, satisfied laugh and said that was exactly the kind of decisiveness the board needed to see from her. She smiled at him because the moment demanded it. Because 30 seconds ago, she had needed exactly this reaction from exactly this man. But the floor didn't feel steady beneath her anymore. She caught out of the corner of her eye Priya Anand from legal standing near the copy room, watching the elevator doors close with an expression that had nothing to do with office gossip and everything to do with dread. The kind of look a person gives when they've just watched someone step off a curb without cleaning for traffic. Claire told herself it was nothing. Priya worried professionally. It was quite literally her job. Inside the boardroom 20 minutes later, Claire delivered her quarterly defense with a precision that surprised even her, citing occupancy rates and renegotiated leases and the slow but real recovery of the downtown portfolio her father had once called the crown jewel of the family's holdings. She spoke about the residential tower on Lexington that had finally cleared its permitting delays, about the retail vacancy rate that had dropped 2 full points since the previous quarter, about a leasing deal with a technology firm that would anchor the West Wing for the next decade. The board members nodded along, some out of genuine reconsideration, others out of the particular boredom that passes for approval in rooms like this. And one, an older woman named Evelyn Marsh, who had sat on the board since before Claire was born, watched her with an expression Claire couldn't quite read, somewhere between appraisal and something gentler. Marcus Delgado, to her mild disbelief, said nothing further about leadership instability for the remainder of the meeting. And when the vote came, it landed 6-2 in her favor. Enough to keep her chair warm for another quarter, at least. She should have felt triumphant walking out of that room. She had, after all, done exactly what she'd set out to do that morning, silenced her loudest critic, and secured her position for another 90 days of scrutiny. Instead, she felt the strange, persistent itch of Daniel's voice in her ears, the calm certainty in a sentence that should have sounded desperate and hadn't, the way he'd looked toward the boardroom glass as though he'd been speaking to someone behind it rather than to her. She told herself the adrenaline of the vote was making her read too much into a disgruntled employee's parting words. People said all kinds of things when they were angry. It meant nothing. It had to mean nothing. She found Priya waiting for her outside the boardroom, arms crossed, the fluorescent light doing nothing kind, for the tension pulling at the corners of her jaw. Priya asked without any preamble whether Claire knew what she had just done, and Claire, still riding the adrenaline of the vote, said she had done exactly what the moment required, that a janitor with 2 missed shifts and an unlocked supply closet was hardly a controversial termination. Priya's mouth tightened into something between a wince and a warning, and she said, lowering her voice so the passing assistants wouldn't catch it, that Claire needed to talk to human resources before end of day, that some terminations came with more paperwork than others, and that this was one of those. When Claire pressed her to explain exactly what she meant, Priya only shook her head and said it wasn't her place to say more, that legal protocol required certain disclosures to originate from a specific department, and that Claire would understand soon enough, and that soon enough might not feel soon at all. once it actually arrived. Claire spent the rest of the afternoon telling herself that Priya's warning was nothing more than legal caution, the reflexive hedging of someone whose job was to imagine worst-case scenarios for a living. She buried herself in a stack of contracts that needed her signature before the close of business, initialing pages without fully reading them, her mind circling back again and again to the moment Daniel had looked past her toward the boardroom glass, as though he'd been speaking to an audience she couldn't see. She thought unbidden of her father, of the way he used to walk the building floor by floor every Friday afternoon, shaking hands with security guards and cleaning staff alike, calling them by name in a way that had always struck her as faintly performative, until she was old enough to realize it wasn't performance at all. It was memory. It was respect earned over decades she hadn't been alive for. She wondered, with a discomfort she quickly pushed aside, whether her father would have known Daniel's last name. By 6 that evening, the office had thinned to its usual skeleton crew of analysts chasing deadlines and cleaning staff who had not yet been told their headcount was short one man for the night shift. Claire stood at the window of her father's old office, the one she still hadn't fully made her own 3 years later, watching the city assemble itself into a grid of gold light against the coming dark. The same view he used to stand in front of with his hands in his pockets, saying nothing for minutes at a time. Her phone buzzed against the glass desk behind her, an email notification from an address she didn't recognize. The subject line reading only, "Regarding today's termination." She almost ignored it, told herself it could wait until morning, until the adrenaline had faded and she could face whatever accusation of impropriety human resources had prepared for her. But something in the immediacy of it arriving so soon after Priya's warning made her open it anyway, her thumb hovering half a second longer than it should have. The email came from the general counsel's office, forwarded from a legal notification system she'd never had reason to interact with before. And it informed her, in the flat, bureaucratic language of corporate law, that as of that morning's termination, formal notice had been triggered under a clause in the company's ownership trust requiring board disclosure whenever any employment action affected a member of the controlling shareholder group. Claire read the sentence 3 times before the words rearranged themselves into something she could actually understand. And when they did, the floor beneath her did not merely tilt this time, but seemed to drop away entirely, the way a staircase feels when your foot expects one more step and finds nothing. Attached to the email was a single scanned document, an ownership registration filed 11 years earlier, bearing a name she had seen 100 times without once connecting it to a man in a faded Navy uniform kneeling on her carpet. Daniel Cole. Controlling shareholder 61%, Whitfield Meridian Holdings Group. Claire sat down slowly in her father's chair, the document glowing on her phone screen like something radioactive. And for the first time since the vote that afternoon, the triumph she'd felt evaporated, completely replaced by a cold, spreading certainty that she had just fired the one man in the building with more power over her future than the entire board combined. She thought of his face when she'd said his name, the absence of fear in it, the way he'd folded his apron with a care that made no sense for a man about to walk out unemployed. She thought of Priya's warning, of Evelyn Marsh's unreadable expression, of a dozen small things that afternoon that had felt strange in isolation, and now clicked into place with the sickening precision of a lock finally finding its key. Somewhere below her, in a building he apparently owned more of than she did, the elevator doors she'd watched him disappear through that morning were, she now understood, not an exit at all, but the opening move of something she hadn't even known she was playing. Claire did not sleep that night, though she tried lying in the dark of her apartment with the document still burning behind her eyes like something projected onto the ceiling. She kept running through every interaction she could remember having with the man she'd known only as Daniel, searching for some sign she'd missed, some tell she should have caught, and finding nothing but the ordinary invisibility she now understood she had built herself. She had never asked him a question that required more than a nod in response. She had never once wondered where he went at the end of a shift, whether he had family waiting for him, whether the job meant anything to him beyond a paycheck. She had looked at a uniform and stopped looking any further, and the shame of that realization sat heavier in her chest than the fear of what his ownership stake might mean for her position. By 7 the next morning, she was in her office before her assistant had even unlocked the front doors. The ownership document printed and spread across her desk alongside every piece of corporate filing she could pull related to Whitfield Meridian Holdings Group. The trust structure was old, older than her father's tenure, even layered through shell entities and family trusts in a way that made tracing actual control almost deliberately difficult. And she wondered, with a bitterness that surprised her, whether that difficulty had been the point all along. 61%. She had spent 3 years believing she answered only to a board that answered in turn to a diffuse and largely disengaged shareholder base. She had never imagined a single name sitting behind 61% of everything she thought she controlled. And she had certainly never imagined that name belonging to a man she'd watched scrub coffee stains out of carpet with his own hands. She called Priya into her office the moment the woman arrived, closing the door behind her before Priya had even set down her bag, and asked her flatly how long she had known. Priya's face did the thing faces do when they're deciding how much honesty a friendship can survive, and she said that legal had been aware of Daniel Cole's position within the trust for years, that it was standard practice to keep such information compartmentalized, precisely so that operational staff wouldn't treat him differently, that the entire arrangement had apparently been his idea from the start. A controlling shareholder who preferred to observe his holdings from the ground rather than from a boardroom. Claire asked why no one had warned her before she'd fired him in front of half the 40th floor, and Priya said, not unkindly, that no one could have predicted Claire would choose that particular man, on that particular morning, as the vehicle for proving a point to Marcus Delgado. The words landed exactly as hard as Priya intended them to, and Claire let the silence that followed sit between them rather than filling it with the defense she wanted to give. Word of the termination had apparently begun circulating through the building's informal channels overnight, the way these things always did, mutating with each retelling, and by mid-morning, Claire had received no fewer than 4 cautiously worded messages from department heads asking, in language too careful to be accidental, whether there was anything they needed to know about recent personnel decisions. She answered none of them directly, buying herself time she didn't actually have, and instead pulled up the quarterly compliance reports she'd signed off on without close reading the week before, searching for anything that might explain why a controlling shareholder would choose to spend his days disguised as maintenance staff rather than simply walking into the boardroom and taking his seat. Ownership didn't hide itself without a reason. Men with 61% of a company didn't scrub carpets for fun. Before noon, Evelyn Marsh appeared at her office door unannounced, closing it behind her with the unhurried authority of someone who had sat on more boards than Claire had years of professional life. She didn't sit. She said only that she had known Daniel's father decades ago, long before the trust existed in its current form, and that whatever Claire thought she understood about yesterday's decision, she understood perhaps 1/10 of it. Claire asked her directly whether Evelyn had known who Daniel was before the termination, and Evelyn's answer was careful, in a way that told Claire more than the words themselves, an admission wrapped inside a refusal to elaborate further. Before leaving, Evelyn said one thing that stayed with Claire longer than she wanted it to, that her father would have asked questions before making an example of anyone, and that questions, not decisiveness, were what had kept this company steady for 40 years. Across the city, in a converted loft above a shuttered print shop that had once belonged to his grandfather, Daniel Cole, sat across a small conference table from a lawyer named Ruth Okafor, spreading printouts of internal financial transfers between them with the particular exhaustion of a man who had been awake far longer than the sunrise outside the window suggested. He had not slept either, though for entirely different reasons than the woman who had fired him. Ruth traced a line down a column of figures with her pen and said the pattern was clear now. 3 separate shell accounts routing money out of the downtown portfolio's maintenance budget over the last 14 months, funneled eventually into an offshore account registered to a name that appeared on paper entirely unconnected to Whitfield Meridian's leadership. Daniel had suspected as much for weeks, which was precisely why he had spent those weeks in a uniform instead of a suit, watching invoices arrive and disappear from a vantage point no executive would ever think to occupy. He told Ruth that the trail led as far as he could determine back to Gerald Voss, the company's chief financial officer, a man who had served under Claire's father for over a decade and whose loyalty had never once been questioned by anyone in the building, including Daniel himself, until 3 months ago. Ruth asked whether he was certain, and Daniel said certainty was still a few steps away, that Voss had been careful, meticulous even, layering the fraud behind maintenance contracts, specifically because no one in leadership ever scrutinized janitorial supply budgets closely enough to notice discrepancies of a few $1,000s scattered across 100 different line items. It was Daniel, admitted with something like grudging respect, an intelligent place to hide a theft, precisely because it required someone willing to actually stand in the supply closets and read the invoices firsthand. Someone no one would think to question. Someone whose presence in the building was so unremarkable that people forgot he could hear conversations they assumed only walls were listening to. Ruth asked him not for the first time why he hadn't simply walked into his own boardroom and demanded an internal audit from a position of open authority. And Daniel gave her the same answer he had given her 3 months earlier when this entire arrangement began. His father had built this company on the belief that leadership should never be so insulated from its own operations that theft could hide in plain sight for over a year. And Daniel had inherited that belief along with the shares, had watched too many companies rot from decisions made by executives who trusted spreadsheets more than they trusted their own eyes on the ground. If he announced himself now, before he had airtight proof, Voss would have every incentive and every remaining hour to erase what evidence still existed. The uniform wasn't theater. It was the only vantage point from which the truth had been visible at all. What he hadn't planned for, and what sat uncomfortably in his chest as Ruth gathered the printouts back into their folder, was Claire Whitfield standing over him with her chin raised, and her voice pitched for an audience, ending his access to that vantage point in front of witnesses who would now remember his face and his termination in exactly the way he'd spent months trying to avoid. The legal notification triggered by the trust clause had been unavoidable, a built-in safeguard he'd insisted on years ago specifically to prevent quiet, undocumented actions against himself or his interests. But it also meant the fiction he'd maintained so carefully was now cracking open at precisely the wrong moment, weeks before he'd planned to have enough evidence to move against Voss cleanly. He had told Claire, standing there with his apron in his hands, that she was making a mistake she didn't yet understand the size of, and some part of him had meant it as warning rather than threat, though he suspected she had heard only the threat. Back at Whitfield Meridian, Claire spent the early afternoon in a meeting with Gerald Voss that had been scheduled a week earlier for entirely unrelated reasons, a routine review of maintenance and operations spending ahead of the annual budget cycle. She had almost canceled it, distracted as she was by the document still sitting in her desk drawer, but something made her keep the appointment, some instinct she couldn't yet name pulling her toward scrutiny rather than away from it. Voss walked her through the numbers with his usual polished confidence, a man in his late 50s whose gray suits always looked freshly pressed and whose voice carried the particular calm of someone who had given the same presentation 100 times before. And for most of the meeting, Claire found nothing unusual, nodding along at line items she barely absorbed. It was only near the end, when Voss mentioned in passing that the janitorial supply budget for the downtown properties had come in slightly over projection again this quarter, attributing it to inflation on cleaning contracts, that something in Claire's memory snagged. She asked him almost idly whether the company tracked individual vendor invoices for those supply contracts or simply approved aggregate totals each quarter. And she watched, with a clarity she would later describe to herself as the first real crack of daylight. A flicker of hesitation crossed Voss's face before he answered that aggregate totals were standard practice, that itemizing every mop and bottle of solvent would be an inefficient use of accounting resources. It was a reasonable answer. It was also, Claire realized with a chill she hadn't expected, exactly the kind of answer a man gives when he has spent considerable effort making sure no one ever asks a follow-up question. She didn't push further in the meeting itself, some cautious instinct telling her that whatever she'd just brushed against deserved more privacy than a scheduled budget review could offer. But the moment Voss left her office, she pulled up every maintenance invoice from the last 18 months she could access, cross-referencing vendor names against payment records with the kind of obsessive focus she usually reserved for hostile takeover defenses. The pattern wasn't obvious. It had clearly been built not to be obvious. But once she knew to look for gaps rather than totals, she began noticing small inconsistencies scattered like breadcrumbs across 100 different entries, amounts that didn't quite reconcile, vendor names that appeared once and then vanished, contracts renewed at prices that made no sense against comparable market rates. None of it on its own proved anything. Together, it painted the outline of something she didn't yet have the full shape of, but which felt with growing certainty deliberate. She thought of Daniel again, of the calm in his voice when he'd told her she didn't understand the size of her mistake. And a new and uncomfortable theory began forming at the edges of her mind, one she wasn't yet ready to fully examine. A controlling shareholder disguised as janitorial staff would have access to exactly this kind of invoice, exactly this level of granular, unglamorous detail that no executive ever bothered to review. It would explain a man with 61% ownership, choosing to spend his days in a uniform rather than a boardroom, if what he was actually doing had nothing to do with observing operations in the abstract, and everything to do with watching invoice by invoice for exactly the kind of pattern she had just stumbled across by accident. She sat with that theory for a long time after the office had emptied out for the evening, turning it over the way she might turn over a stone to check what lived underneath, and found herself for the first time since the previous morning less angry at the humiliation of having fired a controlling shareholder, and more unsettled by the possibility that she had also, without knowing it, fired the one person actively working to protect a company she was supposed to be protecting herself. The thought sat uneasily alongside the memory of his face, the lack of fear in it, the folded apron, the sentence about a mistake whose size she didn't yet understand. She had assumed he'd meant her authority. She was beginning to suspect, with a discomfort that kept her at her desk long after the cleaning crew arrived to replace him, that he might have meant something considerably larger than that. Her phone buzzed once more before she finally left for the night. A calendar notification for tomorrow's stakeholder call, and beneath it, unread, a second legal notice she hadn't yet opened. This one, requesting her formal acknowledgement of Daniel Cole's shareholder status before any further personnel action could proceed regarding the termination. She stared at it for a long moment in the dim glow of her office, aware in a way she hadn't quite let herself feel until now, that whatever came next would not be a conversation she could control the way she'd controlled the boardroom the day before. Somewhere in the city, in a building he apparently also owned, Daniel Cole was almost certainly aware of every discrepancy she had just started noticing, and far ahead of her in understanding what it meant. The invitation had arrived weeks earlier, long before any of this began. A black-tie reception hosted by a consortium of international investors considering a joint venture on the waterfront redevelopment project Claire's father had spent his final years fighting to greenlight. She almost canceled her attendance, exhausted from 2 days of legal notices and quiet dread. But Priya reminded her that half the room would be watching for exactly this kind of withdrawal, reading it as confirmation that the termination scandal had rattled her more than she wanted anyone to know. So Claire dressed in the deep emerald gown she usually reserved for gala nights that mattered, the ones where posture counted as much as portfolio numbers, and told herself that showing up composed was its own kind of correction for the mistake she still hadn't fully reckoned with. She spent the car ride rehearsing the version of herself she needed to present that evening. Confident, but not defensive. Gracious, but not soft. And by the time the car pulled up outside the hotel, she had almost convinced herself the last 2 days had been an aberration rather than a warning. Priya had texted her twice already, once with a reminder about which consortium members to prioritize, and once with a single line that read simply, "Breathe," which Claire chose to interpret as encouragement, rather than the diagnosis it probably was. She checked her reflection once in the elevator's brushed steel doors, adjusted an earring that didn't need adjusting, and walked into the reception with her chin exactly where 3 years of practice had taught her to hold it. The reception filled the top floor of a hotel overlooking the East River. Chandeliers throwing soft gold light across a crowd of investors and developers, and the particular species of consultant who existed mainly to be seen agreeing with powerful people. Servers moved through the crowd with trays of champagne that no one seemed to actually drink, and somewhere near the string quartet, a cluster of analysts from a rival firm was doing the kind of loud, performative networking that always made Claire wonder how anyone got real work done at these things. Claire moved through it with practiced ease, shaking hands, offering the abbreviated version of her quarterly narrative to anyone who asked, and for nearly 40 minutes, she managed to forget almost entirely about supply closets and shell accounts, and a man whose face she had not been able to shake from behind her eyes for 2 straight days. She spoke at length with a pension fund manager from Toronto, who wanted assurances about environmental compliance timelines, and with a soft-spoken developer from Singapore, whose firm had expressed early interest in co-financing the residential towers. And with each conversation, she felt a little more of her earlier unease settle, replaced by the familiar rhythm of doing the job she'd trained her entire adult life to do well. It was Evelyn Marsh who eventually pulled her aside near the terrace doors, murmuring that there was someone Claire needed to meet from the consortium's advisory group. Someone whose insight into the waterfront project's financing structure would matter enormously if the joint venture moved forward. Claire followed without hesitation, grateful for what she assumed would be another useful introduction to file away for later. Claire turned, expecting the usual gray-suited executive with a firm handshake and a rehearsed elevator pitch, and instead found herself facing a man in a tailored charcoal suit that fit him with the kind of precision only custom tailoring achieves. His hair combed back rather than falling loose the way she remembered it. His posture entirely unlike the deferential stillness she'd grown used to seeing from him. Kneeling on carpet. For 1 full second, her mind simply failed to connect the 2 images, the janitor and the man in front of her, occupying entirely separate mental categories that refused to merge. It was his voice that did it, low and even, saying her name with a familiarity that had no business belonging to a stranger she was meeting for the first time in this context. Something in her chest dropped before her conscious mind caught up to what her instincts had already recognized, and for a moment, the noise of the reception seemed to recede into something distant and unimportant. Evelyn introduced him as Mr. Cole, an advisor with deep knowledge of the waterfront portfolio's financial history, and moved away almost immediately to greet another cluster of guests, leaving Claire standing there with her pulse audible in her own ears. Daniel extended a hand, and she took it, because the alternative was making a scene in front of 40 investors, and the handshake lasted exactly as long as professional courtesy required, and not a second longer. He said, in a voice pitched only for her, that he'd wondered whether she'd recognize him tonight, or whether the suit would do enough work on its own. Claire, recovering her composure through sheer force of will, said that recognition seemed like the least of the things she owed him an explanation for, and something flickered across his expression that might have been amusement if the circumstances had allowed for anything so light. A waiter passed close beside them with a tray of hors d'oeuvres, forcing a brief pause in which neither of them spoke, and Claire used the moment to study him properly for the first time, noticing details she had never once registered in 18 months of walking past him on the 40th floor. The faint scar above his left eyebrow, the way he stood with his weight settled evenly rather than favoring one side, a posture that suggested either military training or simply a lifetime of being watched and choosing never to look uncertain. She wondered how much of the man kneeling on her carpet had been performance, and how much of the man standing in front of her now was. And the question unsettled her more than she wanted to admit in a room full of people who would notice if her composure cracked. They found themselves, by unspoken mutual agreement, drifting toward the relative quiet of the terrace, away from the ambient noise of the reception, the city glittering below them in a way that felt almost cruel in its indifference to the tension between them. The night air carried the faint smell of the river, and somewhere below them a barge horn sounded once, distant and mournful. Claire asked him directly without preamble why a controlling shareholder would spend 14 months disguised as maintenance staff instead of simply exercising the authority his ownership stake afforded him. Daniel was quiet for a moment, weighing she suspected exactly how much he was willing to say to a woman who had fired him 2 days earlier, without knowing his name mattered at all. He told her only that some problems couldn't be seen clearly from a boardroom, that authority had a way of making people perform for you, rather than simply be themselves in front of you, and that he had needed to see something as it actually was, rather than as it was presented in a quarterly report. Claire pressed him, asking whether the something he needed to see had anything to do with the maintenance budget discrepancy she'd spent the last 2 days quietly documenting, and she watched him go very still, the kind of stillness that told her more than any answer could have. He asked her what she had found, his voice losing some of its careful neutrality, replaced by an intensity that made her realize for the first time that whatever he was doing mattered to him in a way that went beyond corporate curiosity. She described in general terms the pattern of vendor names appearing and vanishing, the unreconciled amounts scattered across invoices, the flicker of hesitation she'd seen cross Gerald Voss's face when she'd asked an ordinary question about invoice tracking. Daniel listened without interrupting, his eyes fixed on hers with an attention that felt almost disarming. And when she finished, he said quietly that she had just confirmed in one conversation what it had taken him 3 months of scrubbing carpets to piece together on his own. He didn't tell her everything, not that night. Not on a terrace, at a reception where anyone could walk out and interrupt them. But he told her enough. He said the company's chief financial officer had likely been diverting funds through the maintenance budget for over a year, that the amounts involved were larger than a few $1,000s scattered here and there, that he had been building a case, carefully, methodically, specifically because premature accusations against a man as respected and entrenched as Voss would collapse under scrutiny without airtight documentation. Claire felt something cold settle into her stomach, less about the fraud itself and more about the realization that Voss, a man her father had trusted for over a decade, a man who had sat across from her in dozens of budget meetings with an expression of unwavering calm, had apparently been stealing from the company for longer than she'd been running it. She asked Daniel with more vulnerability than she intended to show whether her termination had damaged his investigation, and his silence before answering told her the truth before his words did. He said it had accelerated a timeline he would have preferred to control, that his access to certain invoices and conversations had been useful specifically because no one in the building thought to guard their words around a man with a mop, and that losing that access 2 days ago meant Voss now had one fewer blind spot to worry about exploiting. He wasn't cruel about it, didn't say it to wound her, but the plain honesty of it landed harder than an accusation would have, because it forced her to sit with the fact that her need to prove something to Marcus Delgado had cost more than just an awkward morning. She felt, standing there in her emerald gown with the city spread out beneath them, smaller than she had in years. Inside the reception, unaware of the conversation happening on the terrace, Gerald Voss moved through the crowd with his usual composed charm, shaking hands with the same consortium members Claire had spent the evening courting, laughing at the right moments, complimenting the right people. He had not been invited to notice anything unusual about the evening, and for most of it he didn't. It was only near the bar, catching a fragment of conversation between two junior analysts discussing the termination scandal from 2 days earlier, that something in his expression shifted, a tightening around the eyes that no one at the party was positioned to see. One of the analysts mentioned almost in passing that legal had sent around an internal memo referencing shareholder disclosure requirements, and Voss excused himself from the group he was standing with far more abruptly than his usual polish allowed. He found a quiet corridor near the coat check and made a call that lasted less than 90 seconds, his voice low and clipped in a way that bore no resemblance to the warm, unhurried tone he used in board meetings. He told whoever answered that certain accounts needed to be closed sooner than planned, that a disclosure clause had been triggered that he hadn't accounted for, and that any remaining transfers scheduled for the coming weeks needed to be either completed immediately or abandoned entirely. He didn't yet know that Daniel Cole was the shareholder in question. Didn't yet know that the man he'd occasionally nodded to in hallways over the past year, mistaking him for nothing more than building staff, had been quietly assembling evidence against him this entire time. But he knew enough, from fragments of overheard conversation and a decade of practiced paranoia, that his margin for error had just narrowed considerably, and men like Voss did not survive a decade of careful theft by ignoring narrowing margins. Back on the terrace, Claire and Daniel had settled into an uneasy but functional understanding, the kind that forms between two people who suddenly realize they need something from each other more than they need to remain adversaries. Daniel told her carefully that he intended to move forward with a formal quiet audit request through legal channels within the next several weeks, once Ruth Okafor's documentation was airtight enough to withstand whatever defense Voss inevitably mounted. And he asked Claire, somewhat to her surprise, whether she would be willing to authorize expanded access to certain financial records under the guise of routine board oversight, so as not to alert Voss prematurely. It was, she realized, an unusual kind of trust for him to extend to the woman who had publicly humiliated him 2 days earlier, and she found herself agreeing before she'd fully thought through what it might cost her if the arrangement went wrong. As the reception began winding down and guests filtered toward the elevators, Claire found herself lingering a moment longer than necessary, watching Daniel's profile against the skyline, trying to reconcile the calm authority in his voice tonight with the quiet deference she'd seen in a man kneeling on her office carpet 2 days earlier. She asked him, before she could stop herself, whether the man in the uniform had been the performance, or whether the man in the suit was. Daniel considered the question longer than she expected, and when he finally answered, he said that he honestly wasn't certain anymore which version of himself felt more true. That 14 months of invisibility had taught him things about how people treated each other that a lifetime of visibility never had. The answer unsettled her more than any accusation could have, because it suggested that whatever came next between them would require her to reckon not just with what she'd done, but with who she'd been willing to become. In order to prove herself worthy of a chair she was no longer certain she'd earned the way she thought she had. She left the reception that night with more questions than she'd arrived with, aware that somewhere in the city, Gerald Voss was almost certainly making decisions that would accelerate whatever collision was coming, and aware too that the man she'd fired without a second thought now held not just the fate of her position, but quite possibly the fate of the company itself in his hands, alongside a version of trust she hadn't earned and wasn't sure she deserved. 3 days after the reception, the crisis Daniel had spent 14 months trying to prevent arrived anyway, faster and messier than he had planned for. It began with a phone call from Ruth Okafor at 6 in the morning, her voice carrying none of its usual measured calm, informing him that one of the offshore accounts they had been tracking had just processed a transfer nearly twice the size of anything recorded in the previous 14 months. Voss was liquidating. Whatever caution had kept him moving small amounts through 100 scattered invoices for over a year had apparently been abandoned overnight, replaced by the blunt urgency of a man who believed his window was closing and had decided to take what he could while it remained open at all. Daniel sat on the edge of his bed for a long moment after the call ended, the phone still warm in his hand, feeling the particular vertigo of watching a plan he'd nursed carefully for over a year collapse into something he could no longer control the pace of. Daniel arrived at Whitfield Meridian Tower before 8 that morning, not in a uniform this time, but in the charcoal suit he'd worn to the reception, and the security guard at the front desk, a man named Ochoa, who had exchanged nods with him for over a year without ever learning his last name, simply stared for a long moment before waving him through without a word. Daniel didn't wait for the elevator to take him to the 40th floor. He took the stairs, 2 at a time, Ruth's printouts clutched in a leather folder under his arm. And by the time he reached the executive floor, his pulse was elevated in a way that had nothing to do with the climb. He passed the supply closet where he'd knelt just days earlier, and for a fraction of a second, the 2 versions of himself seemed to occupy the same hallway. The invisible man and the one about to make himself impossible to ignore. Claire was already in her office when he arrived, having received her own early call. This one from the bank's compliance department, flagging unusual activity on an account tied to the company's maintenance subsidiary. The kind of automated alert that usually meant nothing and occasionally meant everything. She'd been awake since 5, coffee going cold on her desk, scrolling through the same fragmented numbers Daniel was racing toward, with a growing sense that something had shifted overnight without her permission. She looked up as Daniel appeared in her doorway without knocking, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The strange intimacy of the terrace 3 nights earlier, colliding awkwardly with the formality of an office neither of them had properly shared since his termination. He said only that Voss was moving money out faster than they had accounted for, that whatever evidence remained needed to be secured within hours rather than the weeks they had planned, and that she needed to call an emergency board session before the day was over. Claire didn't argue. She picked up her phone and began making calls before Daniel had even finished laying his printouts across her desk, summoning board members with the kind of authority that left no room for the usual scheduling negotiations. Her voice clipped and efficient in a way that made Daniel, watching her from across the desk, reassess something about her he hadn't fully credited before. Within 90 minutes, the conference room down the hall held 6 of the company's 8 board members. Priya Anand, seated at the far end with a legal pad already half filled with notes, and Marcus Delgado, wearing an expression that suggested he still believed this meeting was about Claire's leadership rather than anything else, checking his watch twice in the first 5 minutes, as though the inconvenience of an early meeting outweighed whatever justified it. Evelyn Marsh sat quietly near the head of the table, her face unreadable, though Claire noticed she did not seem surprised by Daniel's presence in the room at all, a detail she filed away to ask about later. What none of them anticipated was Gerald Voss walking in 5 minutes after the meeting began, summoned by an assistant who had no idea what the gathering concerned. His gray suit as pressed as ever, his expression arranging itself into polite confusion as he took in the printouts spread across the table and the man in the charcoal suit standing at the head of it, who bore an unsettling resemblance to a janitor he vaguely remembered seeing fired earlier that week. He greeted the room with his usual warmth, commenting lightly that he hadn't realized there was a meeting scheduled, and Claire watched something shift behind his eyes as recognition arrived. Watched the practiced calm he'd worn for over a decade begin almost imperceptibly to fracture at the edges, a hairline crack in a surface that had held for years. Daniel didn't waste time on preamble. He introduced himself for the first time in this room by his full name and his actual position within the company's ownership structure. And Claire watched 6 board members absorb the revelation with varying degrees of shock. Marcus Delgado's mouth actually falling open before he caught himself and rearranged his face into something more composed. An older board member named Frank Isaacs asked bluntly why none of them had been informed of this arrangement sooner. And Evelyn answered before Daniel could, saying only that some safeguards worked better when fewer people knew they existed. A comment that drew a sharp glance from Daniel, but no correction. Voss, for his part, said nothing, yet standing near the doorway with his hands loosely at his sides, watching the room reorganize itself around a truth he hadn't yet been told the full shape of. Daniel then laid out methodically, and without theatrics, the pattern Ruth had spent months documenting. The shell accounts, the inflated maintenance contracts, the vendor names that appeared once and vanished, the transfer that had gone out at 4 that morning for an amount large enough that it could no longer be explained away as a rounding error or an accounting oversight. He walked the board through each document in sequence, his voice steady, occasionally gesturing to Ruth for a specific figure or date. And Claire found herself watching not just the evidence, but the man presenting it, noting the particular calm he carried, even now. A calm that felt earned rather than performed, built from months of quiet, patient work rather than confidence borrowed from a title. He said the trail led directly to accounts Voss controlled, and he said it while looking directly at the man himself, giving him no room to hide behind the ambiguity that had protected him for over a year. Voss's composure held for almost a full minute longer than Claire would have expected, his voice remaining level, as he suggested that whatever pattern Daniel believed he'd found was circumstantial at best, that maintenance budgets fluctuated for 100 mundane reasons that a man who had spent over a year disguised as janitorial staff hardly occupied a credible position from which to make accusations against the company's chief financial officer. He even managed a thin, incredulous laugh, gesturing at the printouts as though they were an elaborate practical joke, rather than a threat to everything he'd built his reputation on. It was, Claire thought, watching him a reasonably good performance, the kind of confident deflection that might have worked on a board less prepared than this one if Daniel hadn't spent months building a case specifically designed to survive exactly this kind of pushback. Ruth Okafor, who had arrived with Daniel and been seated quietly at the edge of the room until this moment, stood and distributed a second set of documents, these ones tracing the offshore account not just to a shell entity, but to a personal address that matched records on file with Voss's own home mortgage, a detail Daniel had specifically saved for this moment, rather than revealing earlier understanding that Voss would need to be cornered by something undeniable rather than merely suspicious. She spoke clearly and without embellishment, walking the board through the chain of documentation with the precision of someone who had anticipated every objection and prepared an answer for each one in advance. The room went very quiet as board members absorbed the connection papers, rustling softly as they turned pages in unison, and Claire watched Voss's face change in a way she would remember for a long time afterward. the practiced calm finally giving way to something rawer and more human, an expression that looked for just a moment less like guilt and more like exhaustion. The exhaustion of a man who had been carrying a lie so long, he seemed almost relieved to have it discovered. It was Evelyn Marsh who finally asked the question none of the younger board members seemed willing to voice. Asking Voss quietly, why, after a decade of loyal service and a salary that placed him comfortably among the company's highest earners, he had chosen to risk everything for money that could never have been worth the cost of discovery. Her voice carried none of the outrage Marcus Delgado's face suggested he was holding back. Only a kind of weary, genuine curiosity, the voice of someone who had known Voss for over a decade and was still trying to reconcile the man she knew with the man the documents described. Voss was silent for a long moment, his hands flat on the table in front of him, his eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance rather than on any of the faces watching him. And when he finally spoke, his voice had lost all of its earlier polish, replaced by something raw and tired that made even Marcus Delgado go quiet. He said his son had been diagnosed with a rare degenerative condition 6 years earlier, one that insurance covered only partially, and that experimental treatments abroad had cost more than his entire salary could sustain, and that what began as a single desperate transfer to cover a single desperate bill had over years calcified into something he no longer knew how to stop. Each theft justified by the last, each justification easier than admitting the truth to anyone who might have helped him find another way. He described haltingly the first time he'd altered a maintenance invoice, how his hands had shaken doing it, how he'd told himself it would be a single exception, a temporary bridge until his son's condition stabilized, and how the bridge had simply never ended, because the condition never stabilized either. He said he'd thought more than once about confessing everything to Claire's father before his death, and had never found the courage, and that the silence had only grown heavier with each year that passed. The room absorbed this in a silence that felt different from the shock that had preceded it. Something closer to a collective, uncomfortable recognition that the story wasn't the simple villainy any of them had expected walking into the room. Claire felt her own anger complicate itself in real time, unable to fully separate the outrage at what he'd done from the unwilling sympathy his explanation demanded. And she noticed Daniel's expression shift as well, the hard focus of the last several minutes softening into something more conflicted, his jaw tight, but his eyes no longer carrying the sharp edge they'd held moments earlier. It didn't undo the theft. It didn't erase the months of careful deception or the maintenance budgets he'd bled dry to fund it. But it complicated the satisfaction anyone in the room might have felt at catching him. And Claire understood, watching Daniel's face, that this was exactly the kind of nuance he had warned her about weeks ago on the terrace. The difference between seeing a problem from a boardroom and seeing the actual complicated human being underneath it. Marcus Delgado predictably called for immediate termination and criminal referral, his voice regaining its usual confident edge now that the shock had passed, and an obvious course of action had presented itself. Arguing that sympathy had no place in a fiduciary decision, and that the board owed shareholders a clean, decisive resolution. Frank Isaacs seemed inclined to agree, muttering something about precedent and liability, and for a moment it seemed the room might simply default to the harshest available option out of sheer institutional habit. Claire found herself, to her own surprise, asking for a moment before any formal action was taken, requesting time to consult with legal about restitution options that might avoid destroying a family already dealing with more than most people could bear, without excusing what had happened or pretending the theft hadn't occurred. She caught Daniel watching her as she said it, an expression on his face that looked almost like the beginning of forgiveness for something she hadn't yet apologized for. And she understood in that moment that this response, This instinct toward complicated mercy rather than simple punishment was precisely the kind of judgment she had failed to exercise 3 days earlier, when she'd fired a man on his knees without asking a single question about who he actually was. The board ultimately agreed after nearly 2 hours of difficult discussion, punctuated by long silences and at least one heated exchange between Marcus Delgado and Evelyn Marsh over the meaning of accountability, to accept Voss's immediate resignation in lieu of criminal referral contingent on a full accounting of diverted funds and a structured repayment plan that Ruth would help formalize over the following weeks. It was a decision that satisfied no one completely, but that Claire suspected her father would have recognized as the kind of imperfect, humane compromise that had kept this company's culture intact for 4 decades. Voss left the room within the hour, escorted quietly by security, in a departure that bore no resemblance to the public spectacle Claire had orchestrated for Daniel 3 days earlier. And something about the contrast sat with her long after the room had emptied a small, uncomfortable mirror held up to her own earlier choices. What remained once the board members filed out and Priya gathered her legal pads and Marcus Delgado offered a stiff, awkward congratulations to Daniel that no one quite knew how to receive, was the two of them alone in the conference room, the printouts still scattered across the table between them like the debris of something that had finally been resolved. The afternoon light had shifted while they'd been sequestered inside, slanting now through the windows in long amber bars across the table. Claire asked him quietly whether he had known walking into that meeting that Voss's story would turn out to be more complicated than simple greed. Daniel said he'd suspected as much for weeks, that the pattern of the thefts, small and desperate at first, before growing bolder, had never quite matched the profile of a man stealing purely for enrichment, but that he'd needed the full evidence regardless, because sympathy without proof would never have been enough to stop the bleeding. She asked him then the question she'd been carrying since the reception, since the terrace, since the moment she'd first opened that email with his name attached to 61% of everything she thought she controlled. She asked whether he intended to remove her now that the crisis had passed, now that the board had seen firsthand how badly she'd misjudged the man standing in front of them. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an expression she couldn't fully read, and when he finally answered, he said that removing her had never actually been his intention, that his 14 months in disguise had been about protecting the company from Voss, not about auditioning her for a job she'd already inherited fairly. He said the termination had hurt more than he expected it to, not because of the financial inconvenience of losing a paycheck he didn't need, but because of what it revealed about how easily she'd been willing to dismiss someone she'd decided, without evidence, wasn't worth a second thought. The honesty of it landed harder than any accusation could have, and Claire found herself apologizing in a way she hadn't allowed herself to do since this entire ordeal began. Not the careful, liability-conscious apology she might have offered a disgruntled former employee, but something raw, an acknowledgement that she had spent 3 years so afraid of being underestimated that she had built the exact same blindness into her own judgment that she'd once resented in the men who doubted her. She said she understood now, in a way she hadn't 3 days ago, that the uniform had never been the disguise. Her assumptions had been. Daniel listened to all of it without interrupting, his expression softening incrementally with each admission, and when she finished, he said only that he appreciated the honesty, and that whatever came next between them, professionally or otherwise, would need to be built on considerably more of it than either of them had offered so far. Outside the conference room, word of Voss's resignation and Daniel's true identity had already begun spreading through the building, with the particular speed reserved for scandals too large to contain, and by the time Claire and Daniel emerged separately an hour apart, the 40th floor had transformed into something closer to a hive of stunned whispering than a functioning office. Claire caught fragments of it as she walked toward her office, glances that lingered a beat too long, conversations that quieted as she passed, and she understood that whatever reputation she rebuilt from this point forward would have to be earned all over again. This time, on the foundation of what she'd actually learned, rather than what she'd merely survived. That evening alone in her father's old office, for the second time that week, Claire found herself thinking not about the crisis that had finally resolved itself, but about the quiet, complicated look on Daniel's face when he'd admitted that removing her had never been the plan. She thought about 14 months of a man choosing invisibility over comfort because he believed the truth was worth more than convenience. And she thought about 3 years of her own life spent chasing exactly the opposite instinct, mistaking visibility and decisiveness for the kind of leadership her father had actually modeled. The city outside her window looked the same as it had every night since she'd inherited this office. Gold light scattered across a grid of buildings that didn't care who ran them. But something in how she watched it had shifted. And she suspected, standing there long after the office had emptied out around her, that whatever came next would require her to become someone considerably more honest than the woman who had fired a man on his knees without bothering to learn his name. The week following Gerald Voss's resignation passed in the strange, disorienting quiet that always follows a crisis large enough to reorganize an entire building's sense of itself. Whitfield Meridian Tower did not stop functioning. Leases still needed signing, and tenants still needed managing, and the waterfront joint venture still required careful, patient negotiation. But something in the rhythm of the place had shifted, conversations pausing a half-second too long whenever Claire or Daniel passed through a room, as though the staff were still recalibrating which version of reality they now occupied. Claire found herself watching people watch her, aware in a way she hadn't been before, of how much of her authority had always depended on performances she no longer entirely trusted. And she spent those days doing something she hadn't done in years, which was simply asking people questions instead of issuing directions and waiting to be obeyed. She met individually with department heads she'd previously only addressed in group settings, asking about workflow bottlenecks and staffing concerns she'd never bothered to solicit before. And she made a point, deliberate and a little uncomfortable at first, of learning the names of people whose jobs had made them invisible to her, the way Daniel's had. She learned that the security guard on the lobby's night shift had a daughter starting college in the fall. She learned that one of the building's 2 remaining janitorial staff, a woman named Marisol, who had worked there for 9 years, had been quietly covering extra shifts since Daniel's departure without complaint or acknowledgement. Claire authorized additional compensation for the coverage without being asked, and told herself it wasn't guilt exactly, though she suspected if she was honest with herself that it mostly was. Daniel, for his part, did not disappear back into the boardroom the way she had half expected him to. Did not suddenly begin arriving each morning in tailored suits to claim the authority his ownership stake had always afforded him. He kept a lower profile than his position technically required, working closely with Ruth Okafor to finalize the restitution agreement with Voss, and quietly meeting with the board's audit committee to establish new oversight protocols that would make the kind of fraud Voss had perpetrated significantly harder to hide in the future. Claire found herself more than once that week walking past the supply closet on the 40th floor and feeling an unexpected pang of something she didn't immediately recognize as loss, an absence shaped exactly like a man she had spent 18 months failing to see. It was Priya who finally said aloud what Claire had been carefully avoiding acknowledging even to herself, cornering her in the break room on a Thursday afternoon and asking with the particular bluntness only a genuine friend could get away with, whether Claire intended to do anything about the way she lit up every time Daniel's name came up in conversation. Claire denied it immediately and unconvincingly, and Priya simply raised an eyebrow and said that legal counsel's professional opinion, offered entirely free of charge, was that pretending not to notice something obvious rarely made it less true. It just made the eventual reckoning more awkward for everyone involved. Claire told her to get back to work. Priya laughed and did not let the subject drop entirely, bringing it up twice more before the week was out in increasingly unsubtle ways that Claire pretended to find annoying and did not entirely succeed at pretending. The reckoning, when it finally came, arrived on a Saturday morning that neither of them had planned for, in a location that belonged to neither the boardroom nor the 40th floor. Claire had gone to the building on her day off to review contractor bids for the waterfront project and the relative peace of an empty office, and she found Daniel there ahead of her, not in a suit this time, but in jeans and a worn gray sweater, standing at the window of what had once been her father's office, with his hands in his pockets, looking out at the same skyline she'd watched a dozen times that week, without ever quite seeing it the way she suspected he did now. He told her when she asked that he came back sometimes on quiet weekends, that the building still felt like his father's more than his own most days, that ownership and belonging were apparently two entirely different things he was still learning to reconcile. She asked him, standing there in the doorway of an office that had once been his, and then hers, and now seemed to belong uncertainly to both of them, why he had really chosen to disguise himself for 14 months, instead of simply confronting Voss the moment his suspicions began. Daniel was quiet for a while, considering the question with the same careful weight he gave most things. And when he finally answered, he admitted that the fraud investigation had only ever been part of the reason. The fuller truth, he said, turning from the window to face her directly, was that he had spent most of his adult life being seen only for what he owned, rather than who he was. Courted by people who wanted access to his money and avoided by people who assumed his money made him unreachable. And that somewhere in the process of building the disguise to catch Voss, he had discovered he liked being invisible in a way he hadn't expected to, like the ordinary decency of conversations that had nothing to do with his net worth. Liked being handed a coffee by someone who had no idea it mattered whether he tipped or not. Claire absorbed this, quietly understanding, for the first time, the full shape of what she had actually taken from him when she'd fired him in front of half the 40th floor. It hadn't just been access to invoices and conversations useful to his investigation. It had been the last place in his life where he got to exist as simply a person, rather than a fortune with a face attached to it. And she had ended that with a sentence delivered for an audience of one board member she'd been trying to impress. She told him this haltingly, the apology she'd offered in the conference room days earlier suddenly feeling incomplete in light of what she now understood. And Daniel listened to her say it with an expression that suggested her understanding mattered to him more than the apology itself ever could have. He told her then something he hadn't planned to say, admitting that in the weeks since the termination he had found himself unable to stop thinking about her, not merely as the woman who had wronged him, but as someone whose company he had genuinely enjoyed during the brief, unguarded moments they'd shared before either of them knew who the other truly was. Moments during his time on the 40th floor when she'd occasionally offered a distracted, ordinary kindness to the janitor mopping near her office. A kindness that had nothing to do with power and everything to do with the person she was when she wasn't performing for a boardroom. Claire felt something in her chest loosen at the admission, a tightness she hadn't fully realized she'd been carrying since the reception, since the terrace, since the moment recognition had first crashed over her like cold water. She admitted in turn that she had spent the better part of the week trying to convince herself that whatever she felt toward him was simply professional respect, complicated by guilt, and that Priya's blunt interrogation in the break room had made it considerably harder to maintain that fiction to herself. She said she didn't entirely trust her own judgment anymore, not after everything the last 2 weeks had revealed about how badly she'd misread the people around her. And Daniel said gently that trusting judgment built on newly acquired honesty seemed considerably safer than trusting the judgment that had led her to fire him in the first place, and that perhaps the point wasn't to trust herself perfectly, but to keep choosing honesty over performance, one decision at a time, the way she'd been doing all week, without fully realizing it. They talked for a long while after that, standing in the office that had belonged to 2 generations of a family neither of them had fully finished grieving. About her father's habit of learning every employee's name. About Daniel's father's insistence that leadership required proximity to the ground rather than distance from it. About the particular loneliness of inheriting responsibility for something built by someone else before you were entirely ready to carry it. Claire found herself talking more openly than she had with anyone since her father's death. And she noticed, somewhere in the middle of it, that the careful, guarded posture she usually maintained in this office had quietly dissolved without her deciding to let it go. It was Daniel who finally asked, with more vulnerability in his voice than she'd heard from him even during the confrontation with Voss, whether she would be willing to have dinner with him somewhere that had nothing to do with 40th floors or board meetings or the particular performance either of their names carried in rooms full of investors, somewhere ordinary enough that neither of them would have to be anything other than exactly who they were, without an audience to perform for. Claire said yes before she'd fully considered what it might mean for the company's optics, for the board's opinion, for the careful professional distance she'd told herself for years was necessary to be taken seriously in a role she'd inherited too young. She said yes because for the first time in longer than she could easily remember, the question of what people would think mattered less to her than the simple, uncomplicated fact that she wanted to say it. The following weeks unfolded with a kind of cautious, deliberate slowness that suited both of them. Neither rushing to define anything publicly, nor pretending in private that something significant hadn't already begun. They had dinner at a small Italian restaurant in the West Village that Daniel had apparently frequented anonymously for years, a place where the owner greeted him by his first name and asked nothing about his last. And Claire found herself laughing more easily than she had in longer than she wanted to admit, watching him navigate a menu with the same unhurried attention he'd once given invoices, understanding that the quiet, careful man from the supply closet and the confident man from the boardroom really had been the same person all along, simply given different rooms to exist in. At the office, they maintained a professional formality that fooled almost no one, though both were careful never to let it interfere with the actual business of running a company that still had a great deal of repairing to do. Claire implemented, with Daniel's input, though not his direct involvement, a new set of internal review protocols that would make budgets across every department more transparent, not merely to prevent future fraud, but because she had come to believe, in the wake of everything, that opacity itself had been part of what allowed both Voss's theft and her own blindness toward Daniel to flourish undetected for so long. She began holding quarterly town halls that included every level of staff rather than just department heads, uncomfortable at first with the informality of it, gradually finding something genuinely valuable in hearing directly from people whose jobs she'd once considered beneath her notice. Marcus Delgado, to Claire's mild surprise, became one of the loudest advocates for her continued leadership in the weeks that followed. Apparently having concluded that a CEO capable of both catching a decade-long fraud and publicly humbly acknowledging her own failures represented exactly the kind of stability the board had been anxious about all along. Evelyn Marsh took Claire aside one afternoon in early autumn and told her, without much preamble, that she had known Daniel's father decades ago, that he had been exactly the kind of quiet, watchful man his son had apparently become, and that she suspected Claire's own father would have found something quietly satisfying in watching his daughter learn the hard way the same lesson he'd tried to teach her as a child about the difference between authority and respect. Gerald Voss's restitution agreement, finalized by Ruth over the course of several difficult weeks, allowed him to avoid criminal prosecution in exchange for a structured repayment plan that would take years to complete, alongside a public statement acknowledging the theft that satisfied the board's need for accountability without destroying what remained of his family's already fragile finances. Claire visited him once, uninvited and unannounced, in the small apartment he'd moved into after resigning, not to gloat, or to extract further apology, but because something in her had needed to see firsthand the actual human cost of a decision that could have gone very differently if either she or Daniel had chosen punishment over understanding. Voss thanked her quietly for the mercy the board had extended and told her that her father, whom he'd worked beside for over a decade, would have been proud of the choice she'd made, a comment that stayed with her longer than she expected it to. By the time the waterfront redevelopment project finally received its final round of investor approval in late autumn, the company Claire ran looked meaningfully different from the one she'd been defending in that boardroom months earlier. Not because the numbers had dramatically improved, though they had improved somewhat, but because the culture underneath the numbers had shifted in ways that felt to Claire considerably more durable than any single quarter's earnings. She found herself, more often than not, walking the building, floor by floor, the way her father used to, greeting security guards and cleaning staff by name, asking questions she'd once been too busy or too insulated to think to ask. And she understood doing it, that this had never actually been about learning Daniel's name specifically. It had been about relearning a way of seeing people that she'd let atrophy somewhere in the process of trying to prove she deserved a chair she'd never actually needed to prove herself worthy of in the first place. On a cold evening in December, nearly 6 months after the morning she'd fired him in front of half the 40th floor, Claire stood with Daniel on the same terrace where they'd first spoken honestly to each other. The city spread out below them in its familiar grid of gold light. Snow beginning to fall in the kind of soft, unhurried way that made the whole skyline look momentarily gentler than it had any right to be. Daniel told her, watching the snow rather than looking at her directly, that he had spent most of his adult life believing that being seen clearly by another person was a luxury his circumstances didn't really allow him. That money and power had a way of distorting how people looked at you, long before they ever really saw you. And that somewhere over the past 6 months, without either of them fully planning it, she had become the first person in longer than he could remember who seemed to see him as simply himself, uniform or suit, entirely unrelated to his balance sheet. Claire told him in turn that she had spent 3 years believing leadership meant never admitting a mistake large enough to be called what it actually was, and that firing him publicly had in a strange and painful way been the single most useful mistake of her career. Not because the humiliation itself had taught her anything, but because the process of reckoning with what it revealed about her own blindness had forced her to become someone she suspected her father would have actually recognized, rather than the anxious, performance-driven version of herself she'd built to survive board meetings and skeptical shareholders. She said she didn't know exactly what came next for either of them, professionally or otherwise, but that she no longer felt the need to know exactly that. Some things, apparently, were worth discovering slowly, rather than deciding all at once under pressure from an audience. Daniel turned to her, then snow settling lightly on his shoulders, and said that he'd learned over 14 months of invisibility, followed by 6 months of being seen more clearly than he'd expected to be, that the people worth building something with were the ones capable of admitting they'd been wrong, loudly enough for everyone to hear, and then spending the following months proving quietly and consistently that the admission had actually changed something, rather than simply serving as a performance of contrition. He said he believed, watching her over these last months, that she had done exactly that, and that whatever came next, he intended to be there for it. Not as a controlling shareholder monitoring an investment, but simply as a man who had finally found someone willing to see him the same way, whether he was holding a mop or signing a merger agreement. Claire reached for his hand on the terrace railing, snow collecting in the space between their fingers before it melted from the warmth of contact, and she felt standing there something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in the 3 years since her father's death. A sense that the company, the building, The whole complicated inheritance of a life she hadn't entirely chosen might actually be something she could carry without losing herself in the process, as long as she carried it honestly, and as long as she didn't have to carry it entirely alone. Below them, the city continued on in its usual indifferent rhythm, cars threading gold light through falling snow, entirely unaware that two people on a 40th floor terrace had just quietly decided without any further need for grand declarations that whatever they built from here forward would be built on considerably steadier ground than either of them had started from.